My name's Dan Gottlieb. I'm the technical lead for Smart Health IT, which is a joint project of Harvard Medical School and Boston Children's Hospital around building an app platform for healthcare. And I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by that. But first I wanted to talk about a report that we put out earlier this year. So we got a grant from the federal government in the United States to enhance our app gallery. And as part of that, they asked us to talk to clinical leaders about what sort of apps they're using today, what sort of apps they're interested in using, and then some of the challenges and barriers to adopting apps. So we worked with class research to interview healthcare leaders at about 50 healthcare institutions, ranging in size from like 2 doc practices all the way up to large 500-bed academic medical centers. And so we produced this report, which is free on our website, so you can go and download it, and I'd encourage you to do that. It's pretty interesting. But one of the quotes that jumped out at me from this report is that this came from a physician, but it was echoed by a lot of the CIOs we interviewed, who said, we had this wonderful population health tool, but we couldn't get the EHR system to interface with it, so we had to enter information by hand. We just had to give up on that because we couldn't physically keep up. And so this is really the core problem that we're trying to solve with Smart. We want to make it easy to connect healthcare apps to clinical systems. And James talked a little about this, so I'll kind of move quickly through this part. And when we talk about healthcare apps, a lot of people's minds jump right to mobile apps on a cell phone. And certainly that's one use case. But actually the most common case for healthcare apps now are, certainly in the US, is EHR embedded apps that run within a web browser inside the EHR. So there's a pretty broad range of types of apps when we talk about apps. And when I talk about clinical systems, a lot of people's minds jump right to EHRs. But in this case, a clinical system could be a patient portal that you're trying to connect apps to, or a clinical data warehouse, a document repository that's pulling information from multiple EHRs and maybe some patient data like patient-reported outcomes. And so to make it easy to integrate these two things, Smart kind of fills in the pieces in the middle. And there's really 4 things there. The first is clinical data, and so for that we're based on the FHIR standard. So FHIR handles the standard data models, standard APIs between these systems. And then Smart builds on that. It specifies using a standard called OpenID Connect for single sign-on. So if you're using an EHR or a different clinical system and you switch into the app, you shouldn't have to have a different username and password and log in again. It should be able to carry that through into the app to make it streamlined. And similarly with authorization, Smart defines a language called scopes for specifying specifically which data elements the app is requesting access to. And then the user can choose to allow or deny that access. So it really provides that mechanism. That's using a standard called OAuth. Kind of constrained for the healthcare use case. So OAuth is a very broad standard with a lot of moving parts. And so the Smart specification kind of narrows that to the healthcare use case. And then the last piece is user experience integration. So if you have a patient open in your EHR and you switch to an app, you shouldn't have to start from scratch again with a patient picker. It should be able to carry through who the current patient is, who the current encounter is. And so Smart defines some of the mechanisms for that to work. And so the point is really, from a user perspective, to enable app substitutability. So if you're using an EHR and there's a growth chart, but let's say it doesn't have the growth curves you want for premature infants, you should be able to swap in a growth chart that does have the growth curves you want without having to jump out of your workflow, switch into a different app, pick the patient again, maybe re-enter some of the data that's already in the EHR. And from a developer perspective, the idea is to lower barriers to entry. So instead of having to learn how each system, what integration points exist for each EHR, you can use these web standards like FHIR, which use modern APIs. And because it goes across different clinical systems, there's a large community of developers to work on things like software libraries. The goal is really that a single app can run in systems from different companies, different vendors. That's true to some extent today. So for example, if you wanted to run an app in Cerner and in Epic, you can do that. There's still some slight tweaks, but it's a lot faster than starting from scratch with different APIs. And then the last piece is that a single app should be able to run in different contexts. So you could imagine an app that does a risk calculation, and it might have a patient-facing component that runs in a patient portal and has a kind of a user-friendly user interface, and then a provider-facing component that has a much more dense data, with more detailed data that would run inside an EHR. but both of those could share the same calculation logic, the same data access logic, the same data models. And so what we really want is that EHRs and clinical systems become more of a platform and handle the things that every app needs, like user and patient management and logging for regulatory compliance. And then apps can be kind of an innovation layer on top of that. So when I talk about the smart platform or a smart ecosystem, we're really talking about 4 things. The first is some of these standards that I mentioned. So we have a smart specification, which James mentioned. We're working to pull as much as we can into the FHIR specification, or the FHIR standard. But that's based on FHIR, OAuth, and OpenID Connect. We have a set of open source tools and resources, some of which are developed by my team, some of which are developed by the community. And those are, I'll talk a little bit about those. We have expanding industry support and some really interesting innovation that's being done under the smart umbrella. And then we have a public app gallery, which I'll talk about a little bit and hopefully show a demo of, assuming our servers are up, which was a question before. So I'm going to skip through a lot of the tech parts, but I'm happy to talk about OAuth all night, so anybody can grab me afterwards and we'll go through some of that. They're in the slide deck that we're going to distribute, so if you're interested in some of these things around how the smart launch works and some of the standards, it'll all be there. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the tools and resources that we have. Because SMART is based on these open standards, you can build SMART support into any language, but to make it easier for developers, the SMART team maintains libraries for HTML5 for web apps, for iOS, for iPhone and iPad apps, and then for Python, often used for server apps. And then the community maintains libraries for .NET, for Ruby, and for Java. I should mention, this is a good time, I meant to mention this at the beginning, our team is a nonprofit effort. All the software we develop is open source. It's all available on GitHub and connected through our website. I'll put up some URLs at the end, but if you go to our website, you can get access to any of this. We also have a public sandbox for testing. So the idea is that if you are building an app or you want to test an app, and you don't want to do it on your real EHR, or you don't have access to an EHR, we maintain a server in the cloud that simulates the EHR side of the equation. It has sample data. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also have a downloadable version, so if you want to run a local instance on your computer, you can do that. It comes with an installer. It'll set it up in a virtual machine. You can also, the installer will even set up cloud-hosted versions for you if you want, if your organization wants your own version. But one of the things about this slide that I think is really exciting is that when I started giving this talk about 1.5 years ago, or 2 years ago, there was only one logo on this slide. So SMART had really the only public sandbox for testing smart apps. And today, a lot of the EHR vendors have launched their own sandboxes, which mimic their production environment for building and testing apps. So Epic, Allscripts, and Cerner all have public sandboxes. You don't need to be a member of their developer program to start building an app. You can actually start just by signing up to on their websites. Down the road, when you distribute the app, they have some additional restrictions in terms of joining their developer program, but it's easy to get started. There's also a neat server from Health Intersections, which is Graham Grieve, the creator of FHIR, maintains. And then there's a server from the Health Services Platform Consortium, which is a group of healthcare institutions that maintain a sandbox environment also. I should also mention both our sandbox environment and HSPCs are based on Happy, which is a really great FHIR server. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about our clinical data. So under this grant for the App Gallery, we were able to kind of dramatically expand the data we have available. We now have about 1,500 sample patients comprising about 145,000 FHIR resources. We're still working on that, so it's probably going to go up a little bit. A lot of that data is generated using a really awesome open source tool from MITRE in the US called Cynthia, which is a synthetic data generator, and we've been able to, as part of this project, contribute back some fixes to that to make the FHIR support better. We also took some data from the National Health Service in the UK around pre- and post-op patient surveys, and we're able to convert that into FHIR questionnaires and FHIR questionnaire responses. So if you're building or testing apps that use patient-reported data, we now have a data set of about, for 100 patients, of the relevant FHIR resources. And then the third data set I wanted to mention is a little bit harder to access. We were able to license some data from a large health system in the US as de-identified patient data. So we have about 10,000 longitudinal medical records that we can sublicense to app developers. I usually tell people to start with the synthetic data first and see if they can work with that, because kind of going through all the legal hoops to be able to get our actual real patient data is much more difficult. But if you sign a data use agreement for us and there's some insurance requirements and other things around breaches, then you're able to use that data to test apps, which is it's a really neat resource because it's really hard, I'm sure a lot of people here know, to get real world data when you're building apps. 5 minutes, okay. I'm going to go much faster. So we also have some open source apps, tools. Okay, I want to talk about industry support a little bit. One of the things that's going on is a lot of the vendors in the US joined into a group called the Argonaut Project and collaboratively created an implementation guide that includes a subset of FHIR as well as SMART, and chose to support this. So in recent months, Epic, Cerner, and Allscripts have all started rolling out their FHIR and SMART support into production. Right now, Cerner is targeting having most of their clinical sites able to use SMART apps by the end of the year. Epic 2017 release has full support for SMART, so as that starts to propagate, you'll see more healthcare institutions that can just run these apps without having to do any custom or having to build out their own clinical data repositories. And then Allscripts is also launching support in 3 of their EHRs in 2017. And so over coming years, I think there'll be more and more SMART support. I'm going to jump to CDS hooks because I wanted to make sure we talk about this. One of the challenges with SMART is that it's click to run. So a clinician has to go into their EHR, into their clinical system, or to an internal intranet site and actually launch the app to be able to access it. And sometimes they might not know which apps are relevant or might not remember to launch the app. So CDS hooks is a way to incorporate external services into EHRs in a standards-based way. It's based on FHIR. And so what happens is the EHR at certain points in the workflow, for example, opening a new patient record or starting a prescription, will call out to these services, passing them some FHIR data. The services can use smart authentication to connect back in and request additional FHIR data. And then they can return certain types of user interface elements. They call them cards in CDS hooks. There are 3 types of cards. They can show some information to a provider, for example, a warning. They can show a suggestion. So if a provider's creating a prescription and the service has a recommendation, they can add a button to this card to just at one click change the prescription to the recommendation. And then the one I'm most excited about in this talk is app link cards, which actually enables the service to recommend apps to the provider that they can then click and launch within the EHR. As a disclaimer, I should mention CDS hooks is a work in progress, which means if you're interested in this topic, it's a great time to get involved and to start shaping how the standard is developing. The Argonaut group, which I mentioned before, which is a lot of the large EHR vendors and a lot of other folks who are interested in standards, are working on how EHRs are going to adopt this, as well as some of the security model and the app integration as part of their 2017 priority. And then there's some work to align it with other CDS efforts and to finish up some elements of the spec. So I think I'm probably running a little bit low on time, and I wanted to make sure we got to the app gallery. So I'm going to try to switch into our app gallery. Let's see. I think it's open already. Awesome. Can I go full screen? Yes. OK. So this is the Smart App Gallery. It's at apps.smarthealthit.org, or if you don't like typing, it's also at apps.fhir.org. And it's kind of your standard listing site, so the apps are still hosted by the app creators. This is really just a site so that folks who build apps can have a place to post them and get some interest, and then folks who are using systems that support these open standards can browse and see what apps are available. It's free, so you can just go in and register, post an app. We look at the apps for spam, but don't do any sort of screening other than that. And so I'm going to jump into a commercial app first. I want to show two medication-related apps that I think highlight some of the things that are possible to do with this platform. The first one is called Meducation. Oops. I can't type on this. There we go. And so I want to point out a few things about this. So Meducation is actually a really neat app. As a disclaimer, they're on our advisory board. But part of that is because they've been an early adopter of Smart. And so in the listing, they have screenshots. This particular app has a video, but it also lists FHIR version compatibility as well as EHR support, so if it's been tested with specific EHRs. Additionally, this is a web app, so it specifies that there. But I think kind of the coolest part of the app gallery is that we take advantage of the fact that Smart enables apps to connect to clinical systems without having to do custom integration. And we actually connect, optionally, apps in our app gallery to that sandbox I was talking about, to our simulated EHR with the sample data. So, so unlike a lot of things in healthcare, you're actually able to try out these apps live. So I'm going to try that now. Hopefully the demo will work. I should say Meducation is an app that does medication instruction translation. So if you have a provider who speaks English and a patient who speaks, let's say, Mandarin, then the provider is able to give them a schedule for their medications as well as instructions in their language. So what's happening here is it's popped me into our simulated EHR, and it's asking me to pick a patient. If you were launching this application from an actual EHR system in a hospital, of course, you'd have a patient already open at this time. So I'm going to pick Mildred. And so what it's doing now, if you look at the URLs, it's calling out back to the Meducation server and passing it a token to be able to access this data. And that happened really quick. There was kind of a back and a forth. But it was able to pull in these medications from our sample data set for this sample patient. So this is the same way it would work at a clinical institution if they were launching it from an EHR. You can pick any of, I think, 20 some odd languages. And what it'll do is it'll do translation of the medications and kind of create a sheet in the patient's language. And so one of the reasons I think this is really neat is that this is, the company has been maintaining custom interfaces for each EHR. Currently, they have about 5 EHRs they integrate with. And they're starting to phase those out now in favor of just maintaining a FHIR interface and kind of saying to new implementations that as you integrate this app, we'll have a FHIR version, which is a huge cost savings for them and also simplifies integration at the healthcare institutions. So it's an example of an app that perhaps a hospital wouldn't purchase if they had to do an extensive integration, but because they're able to launch this as a Smart app and still pull in all the patient's medications, they might adopt it. And I wanted to show one other app, which I've kind of preloaded here, which is an app from Duke Medicine. So Duke was an early adopter of Smart. They actually have an Epic system, but built their own Smart interface between the Epic APIs and the Smart and FHIR APIs, so they'd be able to build Smart apps. And this is a research app. Just going to launch it here. This is a research app that that they created to see if, for a study that looks at whether having a patient do an exercise with their medications increases adherence. And so what's happened again is it's pulled in the medications here, and you can pull in data other than medications, despite the fact that both of my examples were that. And then it can launch an exercise that can be run on an iPad or in the browser. Let's see. Well, it's not running right now in the browser, but it can run in the browser. And basically, it's a drag and drop environment where patients are able to pull their medications into morning, evening, daily, weekly type of schedule. And what they're trying to do is then track over time whether that improves adherence. And the reason I like to show this app is that it's a study where they wouldn't have been able to do it without Smart. This is what they told us. Basically, because they were able to do the integration without having to hire people who were experienced with Epic integration, they were able to create the study. So when they talked to providers, they didn't want to re-enter all the medication data. And it would have been cost prohibitive to hire developers who had experience with the EHR system, but because they were able to kind of use FHIR, use these open standards that a lot of developers are familiar with, they were able to build this app and do this study. So those are two examples of kind of a commercial company that's starting to do their integrations in a much more efficient way, and then a study that was able to build an app at a really low cost because they're able to use these open standards. Let me flip back.
Heads up on time.
Yep.
We're at time, but I'm sure there's a lot of interest, so if you've got something or questions.
Yeah, so I think I'm pretty much done. I wanted to put up my information, so that's my email. Everybody's welcome to get in contact with me. This is the URL, smarthealthit.org, that has a link to our developer documentation, all of our code, as well as kind of general information about the project. Thanks.